Started, we're going to talk a little bit about Bacon. Francis Bacon, who coined the phrase "Substantia postus este," which is a Latin phrase that means knowledge itself is power. And you might not have heard that phrase, but you've heard the phrase knowledge is power. And while there's debate as to who actually came up with the phrase knowledge is power, there is no debate as to the truth in that phrase. With information literally at the fingertips of the masses, it would be easy for one to say that media doesn't necessarily have sway on the public because they can easily research information that's being provided. The problem with that is that people don't actually follow through and do additional research. And so they rely on the frames that are being presented to them. So, what exactly is a frame? Well, we think about the structure of our homes, we think about the picture frames on our walls. Each does something very specific. Frames on our walls, they make our picture edges look nice and clean. The frames of our houses actually build the structure to which holds everything else together. Without them, there would be no organization. Without them, there would be nothing holding them together. Well, that's very similar to media framing. So media framing is a little bit different than media agenda setting, which agenda setting is the information that media choose to report on. Media framing is essentially how they set that particular information up to provide information to the masses. Essentially, journalists are tasked with going out and taking very complex stories, breaking them down, figuring out what is the most important aspect of that story, and then putting it together in a way that people would understand. Now, that being said, two different journalists can go out, see the same exact story, come back and write completely different stories based on the information that they saw. Also based on the way that they word or phrase their particular information. Now, it is important to distinguish the difference between journalism and commentaries and editorials because sometimes the difference is only so slight, but it's just enough to make a huge difference. So when it comes to true journalism, when someone is writing a story, whether it's for broadcast or for print, ultimately that story is written based on facts. Now, those facts can be organized in such a way to tell different stories. However, it's only the facts. Whereas an editorial or a commentary is based on someone's opinions, maybe wrapped up with a little bit of fact, but ultimately it is their opinions, not necessarily the truth. It's also important to note that each of us are individuals. So as a journalist going in to look at a story, everything that makes us who we are ultimately shapes that story in the way that we perceive facts, the way that we take in information. And all of this is extremely important to understand as we move forward as mass communicators. Now, media framing is not a new phenomenon. In fact, in the 1900s, framing could be seen in the reporting of the Elwha Dam construction. So the Elwha River spanned 45 miles along the northeastern eastern side of Washington. And it was the spawning ground for 5 different types of salmon, a primary food source for the lower Elwha Klallam tribe. I know I butchered that. It's really difficult to say. Well, in the 1900s, the tribe actually actively protested the building of this dam. What's interesting about this is that over the span of about 83 years, only 10 stories were actually written about the dam, and only one of them actually mentioned the tribe. The rest of them it talked about the salmon populations and how they were negatively affected due to the dam. Now, from 2004 to 2014, something really awesome happened. So all of a sudden, there was this shift about the framing, and they started focusing on restoring the balance, restoring the the environmental balance. Now, out of the 51 stories that were done from 2004 to 2014, all of them had a restoring the environmental balance frame. However, 15 of those actually focused on restoring the cultural balance that was also initially missed. So there was a significant shift from this prosperity type frame in which the dam was praised to a shift of restoring balance in the environment and also taking a look at how this dam negatively affected the lives of the Elwha people. Now, the Elwha tribe was not the only tribe to be affected by the omission frame, that frame that just omits a side of the story. This also happened to the Quillette tribe. So the Quillette tribe was a hunter-gatherer tribe who had a span of hundreds and hundreds of acres in which they could hunt, farm, and fish. Now, during the treaty, the U.S. government actually moved the Quillette tribe to a 1 mile square. Now, this 1 mile square was situated right between the coast and the Quillette River. And unfortunately, what this did is it caused them to be unable to move freely away from flooding and tsunamis. The omission frame has been used throughout history, and in fact, the omission frame it's been seen in many different places, mostly around the lack of telling a minority story. You'll have large cases, large incidents that would receive coverage if it were not a minority group. And this is pretty interesting and significant for many reasons. One, it talks about how history has been written and the way that history is being written now, currently. Now, in 1980, CNN had groundbreaking work. They actually created a 24-hour news cycle. However, it really didn't take off until about 10 years later with the start of the Gulf War. Now, like I said at the beginning, I have used media framing. I've seen it effectively work, but it was very interesting to take a look at this theory and to learn more, and then to put it in perspective. Where you looked, you could see an American flag. Everywhere you looked, there was just patriotism oozing out of the very core of what we would call America. The U.S. Navy had put together a ship called the USS New York, and it was forged with 7.5 tons of steel from the World Trade Center in its hull. It was a magnificent ship. It was actually my first time on ship, and I was part of the public relations team for the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit. And what that was is it was a very small Marine unit that would essentially showcase Marine Corps capabilities on this class of ship. And in the weeks prior to going to New York, we prepared. We worked extremely hard on developing messages that the Marines would have. They would be able to go in prepared and ready to interview and ready to do their part to tell the Marine Corps story. Before getting to New York, and while we were in New York, we started working on press releases, and we ended up sending out press releases to almost 60,000 news agencies using a tool called Focus, which is essentially it's a PR, a public relations software that not only monitors news but also allows you to send press releases out to the masses. Should have monitored for longer. We should have had a long-term accumulated effect of the media on society and on our institution, and that essentially would have solidified what we had done. So what does this all mean? Well, ultimately, it means that we as communicators need to pay special attention to the words that we use, the way that we use them, and how we put information together. But now there are many different tools in our tool bag that we can use to not only gather news, but also to assess it, to look at it, and to determine whether or not it is negative, positive, or neutral in nature, and to better understand whether or not we are telling the full, true, accurate story. Well, guys, that's all I have for media theory. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you around next time. Thank you.